following on from my last video, you have to understand there's an extraordinary delusion running through the political discourse of this country right now in regards to immigration. And it centers on a very specific, highly weaponized panic. And the claim is that there's a massive influx of Muslims entering this country with the sole intention of forcing their religion onto the space. We're talking about overthrowing the common law, implementing Sharia law. Let's have a look at that claim. And when we look at it, let's look at it with absolute clinical honesty. Because when you strip away the hysteria and you actually examine how a modern Western society is actually run, the sheer staggering idiocy of that narrative, it completely collapses under its own weight. First of all, consider the logistics. We're talking about a Muslim minority that makes up less than 7% of the total United Kingdom population. 7%. And the narrative, it wants you to believe that this 7% operates as a highly organized, monolithic vanguard. I mean, do you honestly expect me to believe that working class people trying to navigate a cost of living crisis, trying to pay skyrocketing rent, trying to protect and shield their children from structural hostility, are somehow secretly carrying the administrative blueprints to dismantle a nuclear armed state? Honestly, it's absurd. Muslims in Britain are ethnically, linguistically, and culturally fragmented. A Pakistani heritage community in Yorkshire, for example, has a completely different social, cultural, and political reality than a Somali community in London, or even an Arab community in Birmingham. These guys aren't sitting in a subterranean basement plotting a legislative coup. So let's be honest about what's actually happening here. If you genuinely believe that a minority opening a halal butcher shop or a community centre on the high street is enough to utterly erase your civilizational identity, then I'm sorry, that's not an indictment of Islam. That's a profound, humiliating confession of your own moral insecurity, own cultural insecurity. It means that your own society has been completely hollowed out by consumerism. You have no shared values left. You have no moral core, no spiritual anchor, nothing but shopping centres, credit cards, and reality television. And instead of confronting the financial elite who stripped down your towns bare, closed your libraries, and shipped your jobs abroad, you project your existential anxiety onto a Muslim prayer mat. And when every other political or economic argument on borders fails, they inevitably drop the ultimate third rail of British politics onto the table. They look you in your eyes and they say, what about the grooming gangs? What about Rochdale? You can't, you cannot deny that it's always Pakistani Muslim men. So I want to confront this head on, because child sexual exploitation is one of the most horrendous, stomach-churning crimes a society can witness. It completely destroys lives. And any man who commits it deserves the absolute maximum weight of the law. No exceptions. But we need to understand the systematic sickness in how this horrific reality has been weaponized into a radicalized tool of control. When you point out the actual data, when you bring up the definitive Home Office reviews showing that child sexual abuse is endemic across every single demographic. Every single demographic in this country, and that the vast majority of perpetrators nationally are white. The whole anti-immigration crowd, they instantly shift the goalposts. They run a very specific, very defensive counter argument. They say, well, of course it's mostly white men. This is Britain after all. There's a white majority. So by simple mathematics, the numbers will skew white. But it's specific, group-based grooming. No, that entirely belongs to the Pakistanis. I want you to think about the absolute intellectual bankruptcy of that logic. Think about how completely that double standards detaches itself from reality. Do you understand what I'm saying? When a group of British Pakistani men commit these horrifying crimes, the media and the politicians immediately look for a cultural diagnosis. They claim it as a unique pathology within the Pakistani community. They call it a inherent symptom of Islamic culture. They say it represents a religious disdain for Western girls. The whole crime is collectivized. The entire demographic is indicted. Every single Muslim man walking down the street is now expected to carry the moral guilt, to bow his head and to apologize for a sickness that he had absolutely nothing to do with. But when a group of white men are convicted of the exact same group-based, multi-perpetrator exploitation, and trust me, it happens with horrific, documented regularity across this country. Nobody interviews sociologists about the cultural pathology of white Britain. Nobody stands up in Parliament and asks if there's an inherent moral deficit in white working class culture. No, they when they are white, they are treated as individuals. They're treated as evil anomalies. They are monsters, yes, but isolated monsters. Their whiteness is treated as a blank slate, a statistical inevitability of the majority population that carries no broader cultural meaning. So why is the majority population allowed to produce monsters without those monsters defining the culture? Let's use their own logic. If the crimes of the minority define their culture, then the crimes of the majority must define yours. So let's look at what it says about Western civilization. Because if you want to talk about systematic, group-based, industrial-scale exploitation operating at the highest levels of human organization, then it's not a foreign import. No, it's deeply woven into the institutional fabric of the Western establishment. Look at the record. Look at the culture of Jeffrey Epstein. Look at how the legal, financial, and political architecture of the West spent decades shielding a billionaire while he operated an international network of child exploitation under the protection of global elites, politicians, and intelligence assets. Look at the culture of Diddy. Look how an entire industry of executive, corporate lawyers, they all watched, facilitated, and even covered up decades of systematic abuse and sex trafficking because the predator was wealthy, connected, and individualized. The Western elite didn't just produce individual monsters. No, they built an entire corporate and legal ecosystem to protect them. The bank systems kept the money flowing. The politicians took the meetings. The media, it looked the other way. And here's the dark and uncomfortable truth that you guys will refuse to face. Your disgust with Epstein or Weinstein or Diddy, it's not even genuine. It's entirely performative. You claim to be shocked. You know, you claim to be shocked, but you aren't. Everyone knew what they were doing for years, and let's be thoroughly honest. You aren't actually disgusted by the degeneracy. Because in a financialized, capitalist society, being rich enough to exploit people with impunity is precisely why people want to be rich in the first place. It's the lottery mentality of the modern West. You don't actually hate the predator. You envy the resource that allows him to prey. The only thing protecting a massive percentage of the population from behaving in the exact same way is their comparative poverty, not their comparative piety. Look at your popular culture. Look at the music videos, the social media platforms, the entertainment. It completely glorifies the exact same lifestyle of domination, degradation, and objectification that these men lived out in reality. You completely devour the content. You memorize the lyrics. You make these predators billionaires. And then you've got the cheek to clutch your pearls when they act out in real life what you spent years applauding on screen. Think about it. If Diddy had released the footage of his parties as a music video, his net worth would have tripled. You would have given him an award. You only get offended when the cameras stop rolling and the police arrive. And I feel like this is why they latch onto the Pakistani grooming gang narrative with such frantic, desperate hunger. It's a psychological defense mechanism. You need a token offender with a brown face and a Muslim name. You need to collectivize guilt onto a immigrant minority, so you can burn them at the stake of public opinion. Why? Well, it's to convince yourselves that you are righteous. To convince yourself that your society is moral. It's a desperate act of self absolution. You prosecute the minority to hide the fact that your own system has completely decoupled reward from merit, wealth from value, power from accountability. They don't want an honest, clinical look at how predators exploit vulnerable people across all communities. Because the moment you make the conversation about actual systematic protection, you have to look up at the top. You have to look at the broken, hollowed out institutions that leave the vulnerable unprotected in the first place. They don't want to fix that system. They don't. They want a weapon. They took a profound institutional failure, a failure where social workers and police ignored victims because they were poor. Because they were poor working class girls from backgrounds that the British state didn't care about. And they repackaged it all into a race war. They used the suffering of children to give respectable cover to raw, unadulterated hatred. It's honestly sickening. It's a sickening trick. They don't actually care about the victims. If they cared about the victims, they will be just as loud, just as angry, and just as radical when the abuser is a corporate executive or a celebrity or a politician in a suit. But they're silent. They only seem to find their moral outrage when the predator fits their anti-immigrant narrative. And like I've told you before in all of the videos, the division is the goal. They need you to have low civilizational awareness. They need you to walk around in a cloud of propaganda, thinking that you're walking through a peaceful, sunny park, while the whole time you're actually trapped in a dark, dead-end alley at 3 a.m, surrounded by institutional psychopaths. You know, they need you to believe that the threat to your life is a religious minority or an immigrant family. And they do this so that you never look at the structural rot inside the institutions running the country. You know, so the question is not whether these crimes happen. Why, yes, of course they did. You know, and they are an absolute stain on our humanity. The question is why a system only collectivizes guilt when it suits their political narrative. You know, once you see that mechanism clearly, the whole illusion falls apart. You know, you stop letting them use the trauma of children to justify their hatred. And you start asking the only question that actually matters. Who benefits from keeping us angry and divided at the bottom, while the exact same exploitative structures remain entirely untouched at the top? And you know, to the British Muslim community caught in the middle of this whole theatre, the lesson is simple. You know, stop playing the role of the defendant. You know, every time you rush to a microphone to issue a collective apology or struggle to prove yourself, prove your integration to a hollowed out establishment, you validate a rigged premise. You know, you cannot cure a society's existential insecurity by sacrificing your own dignity. You know, honestly, it wouldn't. It will never be enough. You know, so the moment you stop looking for validation from a system that protects billionaires while weaponizing the trauma of working class children, the trap loses its power. You know, so build your communities, anchor your families. You know, let your integrity do the talking. You are not on trial, so stop acting like it. And once you do, the entire illusion falls apart.